Dorcas Bell leaned into the broken wagon as if it were still meant to roll, boots grinding in frozen ruts. A teamster on the mining road barked a laugh and called it junk, fit only for the iron. She did not answer. She shoved until the cracked axle scraped, and the warped bed inched closer to the cabin wall. Canvas slapped in the wind behind her, and gray clouds packed low over the pines like a lid. Matthew hovered with the hatchet, hearing the men's jokes, watching her drop one side of the wagon like a door. Snow dust skated across the yard, early, wet, and mean, while she began turning ruin into shelter, as if she could outwork the storm. The wagon lay where she left it, hard against the cabin's south wall, its tongue pointing toward the road like a finger that had lost its purpose. Dorcas kept her hands moving, while the laughter still hung in the air. She set a flat stone under the cracked axle to take some weight, then slid a short log beneath the sagging corner of the bed. The old frame creaked, but it did not drop. The cabin sat a short walk off a rough Colorado mining road where ore wagons groaned past in good weather and stopped coming when the season turned. It was a single-room place of peeled logs and chinked mud, with a lean-to at the back that had never been more than a promise. Dorcas Bell was 60 years old, and her grandson, Matthew, was 11. Small for the work, but steady in the way he listened. Matthew had come to her after his mother went east to find kin, and never made it back, and after his father disappeared into the camps looking for pay that did not hold. Dorcas did not dress the loss in big words. She kept a place at the table and a pair of boots by the door, and she taught the boy what winter asked for. What winter asked for most was dry wood. And that year, the stack looked wrong, no matter how she counted it. There was still green timber on the edge of the clearing, and there were dead limbs higher up the slope, but seasoned fuel was thin. A summer of repairs and sickness had kept the axe idle too many mornings. The small shed that should have held kindling had taken wind damage in September, and a hard rain had soaked what little was inside. Wood left on the ground pulled damp up like a wick. Wood left uncovered turned to sponge under wet snow. Dorcas had watched a neighbor lose a season's cutting that way. Once, years before, when the first storm came heavy and warm, the man's pile had looked fine from a distance, tall, proud, stacked like a wall. By the third day, it was a frozen block, and his stove would not draw. He had burned fence rails, then a chair, then anything that would catch. Dorcas had never forgotten the look on his wife's face when the flame died to a sulk. So she studied the broken wagon abandoned beside the cabin in late fall, left by a passing outfit that had snapped an axle on a stone and decided it was cheaper to walk away. The bed was warped. The iron fittings were good. The wheels were still round enough for a child to spin. Everyone saw salvage. Dorcas saw height. "Grandma," Matthew said softly, stepping close as the teamster's wagon creaked away. "They said it'll fold." Dorcas wiped her palms on her apron. "A thing folds when it has nothing under it," she said. Bring the wedges." Matthew fetched them from a crate by the door. Hand-split shims Dorcas kept for leveling the table and fixing the stovepipe. She set them beneath the wagon's tilted side rail and tapped them in with a mallet. Then she rolled 2 rocks into place at the tongue to keep the frame from sliding when the ground iced. It was quiet work, the kind that made sense only when it was done. Toward midday, a storekeeper from the road stopped by on his way back from the camps. He was a thick man in a worn coat, his eyes always measuring what could be traded. "That iron there," he said, pointing at the wagon's fittings. "Snow'll take it. Rust'll eat it. Trade it here now. Flour's high. Coffee, too. You don't want to be sitting on scrap when the cold locks the road." Dorcas kept her gaze on the lashings, as she was threading a length of rope through the wagon's side stakes, tying a loop that would hold a canvas edge tight. "Road locks whether iron moves or not," she said. The man snorted. "You can't burn iron." "No," she replied, "but it can keep what burns from soaking." He laughed like the teamster had, though without the same heat. "You'll be sorry when that axle breaks clean and drops your whole pile into the mud." Dorcas nodded once, as if he had mentioned the weather. "Then it will be in the mud," she said, "and it will still be nearer the wall than it was in the ditch." After he left, Matthew stood with his hands in his pockets, watching the wagon frame as if it might betray them in the night. Dorcas did not ask him to stop worrying. She gave him work. They cut in the afternoon, and not far up the slope where the wind had toppled spruce and left them to dry. Dorcas chose dead-standing trees first, the ones that had shed their needles and sounded hollow under the axe. Green wood could wait. Green wood stole heat to dry itself. Dry wood gave heat back. Matthew carried small rounds and gathered kindling, thumb-thick sticks, dry cones, bark that peeled in curled sheets. Dorcas split the larger pieces with a maul and a wedge, working steady, breathing slow so the cold would not bite her lungs. The boy watched her hands and learned where the grain wanted to open. Before first light the next morning, Dorcas returned to the wagon with a lantern. Frost coated the grass, like salt. She had found an old hide in the loft, stiff, smoke darkened, with holes along one edge where it had once hung as a door curtain. She laid it over the wagon bed, then covered it with a canvas sheet patched at the corners. Over that, she layered brush, pine boughs and willow whips, so the wind would not catch the cloth like a sail. Matthew came out with his cap pulled low. "Is it a roof?" he asked. "It is a lid," Dorcas said. "A roof wants rafters. A lid wants weight." She set weight in a way the wind could not take. Boughs piled thick, then a few flat stones at the corners. The wagon bed became a long trough with a covered top, open on the side against the cabin, where the wall blocked the worst of the weather. She left a finger-width gap along the top edge so damp air could escape. Trapped moisture turned to frost and ruined kindling just as surely as snow. When they began stacking, Dorcas started with kindling near the opening and split fuel farther back. She laid a few poles across the wagon bed slats to keep the wood from sagging into the low spots. Each piece sat off the ground. Each piece had air around it. The wagon, useless for travel, became a raised shelter. For a week, the sky stayed undecided. Some afternoons were bright enough to soften the crust on the yard. Nights returned hard, snapping puddles into glass. Dorcas watched the wind and the clouds the way other folks watched a clock. She moved the wood pile each evening, shifting the smallest, driest pieces deeper under the cover, bringing forward what could be burned soon. She kept the stove fed, never too hot, never too low, guarding the little barrel of flour the way a person guards breath. At the road, men passed and shook their heads. A pair of teamsters stopped once, their horses steaming, as they stared at the wagon pressed to the cabin like a child clinging to a skirt. "One good drift," one said, "and you'll be digging that out till spring." Dorcas handed Matthew a splitting wedge. "Digging makes you warm," she said, and went on with her work. The first sign of trouble showed itself not in snow, but in water. A warm day came with a low sky, and the snow that had fallen in dust turned slick. By evening, a mist settled over the clearing, beating on the cabin logs and soaking the top of every exposed pile. Dorcas walked to the neighbor's place down the road and saw their wood stacked open, darkening at the ends. She did not say anything to them. Advice given too early turned into an argument. She returned home and tightened the wagon cover, adding another layer of brush, weighting it with a split round that would be burned later. That night, the wind rose after midnight. It came from the west, pushing through the timber with a steady shove. The cabin's roof groaned in answer. Dorcas woke before the boy and sat up, listening. She could hear the sound of wet snow beginning, soft, heavy, the way it fell when the world was not cold enough to keep it light. She lit the lantern and stepped out. The air smelled of water and pine sap. Snow clung to her sleeves the moment she moved, sticking like flour to damp hands. She reached the wagon and ran her palm along the canvas. It was slick, but tight. The brush on top held like a mat. Behind her, Matthew came to the door, blinking into the dark. "Is it bad?" he asked. "It is coming," Dorcas said. She spoke as if naming a visitor. "Go back in. Put more water on the stove. Keep it near simmer. Not boil." Matthew obeyed, not because every reason was clear, but because her voice had always been a map that led to warmth. By dawn, the storm had settled in for a stay. Wet snow fell in thick flakes that did not bounce. It piled fast, pressing down on everything it touched. The world grew quiet in that way storms made it quiet. No birds, no distant wagon wheels, only the hush of falling. Dorcas worked outside in short bursts, clearing the cabin door and the stovepipe cap so smoke could draw. She shoveled paths with a board and a short-handled shovel, tossing snow away before it turned heavy and locked. Each time she passed the wagon, she checked the supports. The stone under the axle held. The log under the bed did not shift. The wedges stayed snug. And on the second day, the wind shifted and began to drift. Snow that had fallen straight now flew sideways, piling against the cabin wall and packing into corners. A neighbor's wood pile disappeared under a rounded mound like a buried animal. Dorcas saw it from her yard, and her mouth tightened. Matthew stood at the window, watching the white climb. "Will that be gone too?" he asked. Dorcas looked at the wagon's covered back, the end that faced the open yard. Snow had built there, leaning into the brush. "Snow can cover," she said. "Cover is not the same as soak." Still, she did not trust luck. Near midday, when the storm eased to a steady fall, she and Matthew went out together. They moved slow, pushing through knee-high drifts, the boy following in her packed steps. Dorcas took the shovel and cut a trench along the wagon's open side, making a small working space between the frame and the snowbank. She kept the trench narrow, so wind could not fill it quickly. Inside the wagon shelter, the wood smelled of resin, not rot. The kindling at the front was dry enough to rasp under her fingernail. Dorcas pulled out what would be burned that evening and handed Matthew a bundle. "Feels light," he said, surprised. "Dry wood is lighter," Dorcas told him. "Water is heavy." Back inside, she laid a fire with careful hands. She started with curls of bark, then thin sticks, then split pieces. The flame caught clean. The stove warmed, and the cabin's air changed from sharp to soft. That night, the storm pressed harder. Wind hammered the walls. Snow found every crack and worked into the mud, chinking like a slow tooth. Dorcas stuffed rags into the worst gaps and then hung a blanket over the door. Matthew sat on the floor by the stove, carving a small stick into a spoon shape with the pocket knife Dorcas had given him. His face was close to the work, serious and quiet. "Do you think the wagon will break?" he asked without looking up. "It may," she said. "If it breaks, it will break under snow, not under the stacked fuel. Snow is the thing that cannot be burned." Matthew frowned at the words as if they were a puzzle, then nodded once. The third day brought a new trouble. The temperature dropped hard, turning wet snow to crust. What had been soft became a weight that did not shift. The stove needed more fuel to keep the cabin warm. Dorcas knew what that meant. If the wood supply failed now, there would be no second chance. Wet wood would not catch. Green wood would smoke and choke the stove, and they could not walk to town in that weather. They could not count on a neighbor who had trouble of their own. Near dawn, Dorcas heard a sound outside that did not belong to wind. It was a slow groan, then a sharp creak, like a wagon wheel speaking in its sleep. She sat up at once. Matthew woke too, eyes wide. "What was that?" Dorcas pulled on her coat and took the lantern. "Stay by the stove," she said. "Keep it alive." The door opened to a wall of white. Snow had drifted high against it. Dorcas pushed through, shoulder first, and stepped into a world that looked reshaped. Drifts curved like dunes. The wagon shelter was half buried at the back, the brush roof holding a thick load of crusted snow. Dorcas moved to the side and dug with the shovel, breaking the crust in chunks. She worked her way to the supports, and the log under the wagon bed had shifted a hand's width, pressed by the weight. The cracked axle sagged, but the stone still took part of it. The creak came again as she scraped snow off the roof. The frame was asking for relief. Dorcas did not panic. She chose the simplest help. She took 2 split rounds from inside the trench, dry ones, meant for the stove, and set them upright beneath the sagging corner, like legs. Then she wedged a short pole between the wagon rail and the cabin wall, creating a brace the snow could not push inward. She tapped the wedge with the mallet until the wood bit firm. The wagon bed rose a fraction, enough to ease the strain. Snow fell into her sleeves, melting against her skin and turning cold. The wind tried to steal the lantern flame. Dorcas turned her back to it, shielding the light with her body, and then finished the work. When she returned inside, her face was wet, and her breath made ghosts in the warm air. Matthew watched her hands, red and raw. "It was going to fall," he said. "It was going to complain," Dorcas corrected gently. "Things complain before they fail. That is how they ask for help." They ate a small breakfast, cornmeal mush with a spoon of molasses saved for days like this. Dorcas kept their portions steady. Hunger made a person weak, but waste made the end sooner. By midday, the storm began to move on, though the cold stayed. The sky brightened into a pale sheet, the sun a weak coin behind it. Dorcas went out again and dug a wider trench around the wagon's opening, making sure the wood could be reached without climbing. Only what was needed came out, leaving the rest protected from wind and stray melt, and the wood stayed dry because it had never touched the ground, and because the cover shed the wet before it could seep in. Down the road, smoke thinned over the neighbor's cabin. Dorcas watched and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Thin smoke meant low fire or wet fuel. By late afternoon, someone trudged toward her place through the drifts, shoulders hunched, head down. It was the storekeeper, face red, beard crusted with ice. He carried a small sack and the look of a man who had walked farther than he wanted. "Your stove's drawing," he said, as soon as he reached the door, voice rough. "The store stove is choking. Wood is soaked. The iron was misjudged." Dorcas did not answer the pride in it. She opened the door wider and let him step into the warmth, as she set him on a stool near the stove and handed him a cup of hot water with a pinch of coffee grounds, thin but kind. He looked toward the wagon shelter outside, visible through the window. "You kept it dry." Dorcas stirred the pot. "Kept it off the ground," she said. "Kept it covered. That is all." He swallowed, shame and relief mixed together. "Could you spare kindling? Just enough to start." Dorcas thought of Matthew's face when the dry bundle had felt light in his arms. She thought of the flour barrel and the slow math of days. She also thought of winter roads and the way folks remembered kindness better than trade. She nodded once. "Matthew will bring a bundle," she said, "and 2 armloads of dry deadfall will come back when the weather allows. Not today, when it can be done." The storekeeper nodded quickly, grateful for a debt that was work, not money. Matthew pulled on his coat and went with Dorcas to the wagon trench. He reached into the shelter and drew out kindling that snapped clean between his fingers. His eyes lingered on the braces Dorcas had added. Those upright rounds, the pole wedged against the wall. They laughed, he said quietly. Dorcas adjusted the brush roof with a gloved hand. Laughing is easy, she said. Keeping warm is work. The storm left behind a world that looked finished. But winter was not done. The next weeks brought smaller snows, sharp winds, days that started gray and ended darker. Dorcas kept using the wagon shelter the way it had been planned, taking wood in careful amounts, clearing drifts before they hardened, checking the lashings after each gust. The wagon never rolled again, but it held its new job. As Matthew grew used to the routine, he learned to listen for the stove's sound, to tell when the draft was weak, to feel the difference between damp and dry by weight and smell. He learned that survival was not one brave moment, but a chain of small decisions, each one made before panic. Once, a teamster stopped again when the road briefly opened and saw Dorcas's trench and the covered shelter. Laughter did not come that time. He stared, then nodded, as if something plain had been missed for years. Smart, he muttered. Should have done that with the pile. Dorcas gave him a calm look and went on stacking. Praise was lighter than wood and just as quick to vanish. What mattered was the warmth holding through the night. Near the end of January, another heavy snow came, though not as wet as the first. It drifted deep against the cabin, and the wagon roof took its share. Dorcas was ready. Before first light, she and Matthew cleared the worst of it, breaking crust, pushing snow away from the supports. The braces held. The wedges stayed tight. The wood inside stayed dry enough to burn clean, its ends pale where they had been split and protected. That night, as wind hissed around the corners, Matthew sat close to the stove and watched the flame dance behind the iron door. He looked over at Dorcas, where she mended a mitten by lamplight, needle moving steady through thick cloth. "Grandma," he said, voice small in the warm room. When grown, Matthew said, a shed would be built right, with posts and boards. Dorcas tied off the thread and smoothed the seam with her thumb. "It will be," she said. "But the lesson stays the same, and a thing doesn't have to be pretty to do its work." Matthew nodded slowly, taking that in the way he took in everything, quietly, as if storing it for later use. The worst cold came in February, a week of nights so clear the stars looked sharp enough to cut. The creek froze solid. Even inside the cabin, breath showed in the morning until the stove caught. Dorcas used her driest wood then, the pieces kept deepest under the wagon's cover. Each time she reached in, the smell of resin rose like a promise. The fire lit fast. The stove drew clean. The cabin held warmth enough that Matthew's fingers did not crack, and Dorcas's joints did not lock. Outside, the abandoned wagon looked half like junk, half like a small animal hunkered against the wall, covered in brush and snow. To a stranger, it might have seemed foolish. To Dorcas, it was a tool, and tools did not need to impress anyone. When spring finally loosened the yard and water began to drip from the eaves, Dorcas pulled the brush roof apart and let the canvas dry in the sun. The wagon frame had sagged a little more, and the axle was worse, but it had done what was asked of it. The wood that had stayed dry had carried them through the season, one careful bundle at a time. The storekeeper returned with the promised deadfall when the road cleared, sweating under the load, less proud than before, but more respectful. The teamsters who passed no longer laughed at the sight against the cabin wall. Matthew watched them with a steady look, understanding at last that the best answer had never been words. Dorcas stood in the doorway, feeling the first soft wind of the year. No wide smile came, only a calm look toward the wagon shelter, then toward the boy beside her, and the quiet truth settling in place. The plan had held because it had been built for weather, not for opinions. Subscribe for more calm, realistic, frontier survival stories.